In today's video, I'm going to be covering 5 different sexy flaky animations that you can incorporate in your work. But before we get into the video itself, I just want to say a quick thank you to Artlist, who is sponsoring this video, but more on them later on. If you watched my previous 5 sick text animations that you can create, you might have noticed these title cards which utilize a little bit of a card design. And that is going to be our first animation that we're going to be doing. And I'm just going to start off in After Effects. I've got a 1920 by 1080 composition set up, 23.98 frames per second. And just to keep it nice and simple, you know, nothing new, nothing fancy here. The first thing we're going to do is create the shape of our card. This is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to use the rectangle tool, or if you want to go one step above, you can use the rounded rectangle tool, just in case you want it to be a rounded card, which is completely fine, just gives you that flexibility. So we're just going to create one, and I'm going to change the background color to white. And we just want to size out the card that we want pretty roughly. Something like this should work pretty good. And again, this just depends on the look of the card that you want. You can make it smaller, you can make it bigger, you can make it any shape that you want to. From there, I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna reduce the roundness of it because I actually don't want it to be rounded, but it's just nice having that flexibility. And then I'm just gonna pre-comp this, and I'm gonna name this card pre and just hit OK. And then I'm gonna open that up and of course drag this pre-comp into our pre-comps folder to stay nice and organized. From here, I actually want to change the size of the comp to be the same size as the card to make it a little bit easier when we actually animate it. And one way you can do that is by opening up the properties of this and looking at the rectangle path, the size of it. So we know that it is 486 by, let's just make that a round number. So let's do 485 by 700. We can link this back up, and I'm just going to hit Command K, and we can change the composition size to be the same as that. So 485 by 700, just like that. Now we want to start actually designing it, because this will just be our card background. And let's say we want to add a little bit of a edge to it, so we can duplicate this and just name this card border, and maybe change the color. So in my instance, I had like a dark gray look to it. So I'm just going to remove the fill, and then I am going to add a stroke, and we'll just make it pretty dark here, almost black, and you can see it just gives us a little bit of a border here, and you can increase the stroke width to be however big you want. You can make it whatever color you want. This will look plenty good. Then we can start adding the little detail elements. So at the bottom, I had a little section, and it's super easy to create. I'm just going to use the pen tool, and I'm just going to click and hold shift while I'm clicking in the second spot, and that'll create a little line for us. And we'll just decrease the width of this stroke a little bit, and maybe move this up. So maybe up there, and then I'm just gonna rename this card divider. And let's add some text down here. So we'll just put whatever we want, and I just wanna make sure that it looks clean. We don't wanna crowd it with information because it's just a detail element to add to it. It's not a main focal point. So we'll just name this first animation, something simple like that. And let's decrease the text size a whole bunch, and decrease the spacing of this a little bit. And for this text, since I know it's going to be on the left side, I want to left align this to make it a lot easier if we change the text or anything, so we don't have to mess with the position of it over and over again. And we can just move this out to the side a little bit, and I'm just eyeballing the spacing between the text here and the text from the top to bottom, just so it looks like it's somewhat even. We don't have to be scientific, and I'm just going to decrease the boldness of, or the width of this, the weight of this a little bit, so it's not too bulky. But that looks pretty good, and I'll just uncapitalize all of this, so it's just the first letters that are capitalized. And we can duplicate this, and I'm just going to move this over, and then this time I'm going to right align it, and we'll just drag it over here, and again, just eyeball it a little bit. Card flip, maybe to spice it up a little bit. And you can do something as simple as that, and then let's maybe add another divider in here. So I'm just gonna hit G again to bring up my pen tool, and I'm just gonna click and drag, and then we can just move this down and adjust it to be however long we want it. We can move the position around, position it exactly where we want. So maybe in this case, just for the sake of it, we'll just move it a little bit closer on this side. Maybe something like that looks pretty good from a spacing perspective. And then we can add our main focal point, which is what's gonna be inside the card itself. You can do this a couple of different ways. In my instance, I just use a font. You can also go ahead and use a picture or a shape, so you have a placeholder and you have all that in there. But I'm just gonna create a new text here, and I'm just gonna type in 1, and then I'm gonna find a really nice font. But first, I'm just gonna scale this up and center align it. and then just put it right in the middle for now. This specific look works better with a more decorative font, so like this one right here, which is TT Ramilla's initials. It just looks nicer because it has just that little bit of decorative look to it. You can use a regular font as well, just depends on the look you're going for, but I just felt that this looked pretty good. And you can position this wherever you want, and the thing about this is you will have to move it depending on the number or the letters that you put in there, just because they will have different looks. So the 4 will be spaced slightly differently than the 1, so you might have to play around with the position a little bit, but the best tip I can give you is to go based, or to do it optically instead of actually measuring out. Just what I did for some of them was, let's say this one is pretty big, for example, and I had it covering some at the bottom here, so you can see it just has a little bit of overlap. And an easy way to just cover that up is actually just go in, hit G to bring up your pen tool, and then just add a fill. And let's just select the background color and remove the stroke from this. And then I'm just gonna draw in the lines here of where this is kind of filled up, so something like that, and then just position it behind our text here, or our main, so it just looks like it's actually coming over across that bar and kind of covering that up. Just a nice little detail that just makes it look a little bit nicer and more polished, rather than just leaving it actually being fully overlapped. And of course you want to go in and change these little overlap covers for each one as well, but that's just a nice little tip that I would recommend doing, especially because it's so easy. But that's actually it for designing the card. You can do whatever you want to this, but once you have it designed, you can go back into your main composition where you have your card. And the reason why we created a separate composition for this is so that we just get the borders around this right around it, so we don't have all that extra space. And since we worked with shape layers and text, we can enable the collapse transformations, which will then just give us more quality if we scale up. So if I scale up a whole bunch, you can see we don't lose any of that quality. Now you will have to go in and adjust the edges of all your shapes, so it kind of depends on the use case, but that's just a good tip if you need to scale up a bunch. In our instance, we don't need it because it's not going to be very big. Let's say you want to create a little bit of a card flourish like I had, where you have them spread. Well, that's going to be super easy because we have the pre-comp here, and we can just go in and duplicate it a bunch up in the project window, which will then create true duplicates of our card, so that we can go in and make changes to this. And let's put a 2 instead, and then we're just going to reposition this a little bit, maybe scale this down just a little bit since it's a bit bigger, and move this up, and we can just remove these 2 shapes down here since they're not needed for this. But if we go back in here and we can drag in the number 2, so now we have 2 cards. The reason we want to duplicate it up here is because, as I said, you'll be a true duplicate. If you just duplicate it down here, go in and change it, like let's move the text here, it'll change in both instances. So it's not a true duplicate. For the sake of this, I'm just going to duplicate this a bunch of times because you get the gist of it. To create the flourish, there's a couple of different ways that we can go about this. So one way that I like to do it, because I knew the animation was going to be pretty simple, was link them up kind of like we've done plenty of times before. But before that, I'm just going to select them all and move the anchor point to the bottom so that they all rotate around the same spot, which is down here. Just going to be a nice little flourish. Imagine you're holding a set of cards and flaring them out. That's essentially the look that we're going for. But with the rotation opened up, I'm just going to link one to the next. So I'm going to link the rotation of this one to the one above, and I'm just going to keep going for every single one of these. And then we're going to link the layers themselves as well. Now this comes with some benefits, like if I move the rotation here, you see we get a nice even flourish, even spacing between them all. So that's going to be a little bit nicer in that regard. But it does come with the challenge of we can't really move it we can't move them individually unless we add a transform effect to this, where we can then play around with the movement of each individual one. So we just want to keep that in mind, that it is a little bit more complicated. If you have a lot of instances and you want a really nice flourish, you probably want to link them, otherwise you can do it manually, which just leaves you a little bit more control. With that being said, let's set that to 0, and then I'm just going to create a simple little animation here that just uses the position and the rotation of this. So I'm going to add a transform effect to this first one. I'm just going to keyframe the position exactly where I want it, and then move to the beginning and maybe slide it out to the side a little bit. And I'm just going to hit U to show my keyframes, and let's add some easing. And in this instance, I'm just going to use flow. You can get all of these presets on my Patreon, as well as the project file that we're going to be working in today if you go to patreon.com/Mapal. And I'm just going to apply the super sexy end speed, so it just starts out with a lot of paste, and then slowly eases in. And then we can take this and we can just copy it to all the other ones. And we just want to go to the beginning, and just like that, we have all these coming in, and then we can just stagger them ever so slightly. So in this case, we'll probably want the last one to come in first. So we're just going to move this up, each one delayed by 1 frame. And again, you can use motion tools for something like this, but we're just going to get a nice little flourish here, and it might be a bit hard to see since they're all 2s, and you can even spread it out more. So if you use motion tools, you can just spread it out more, however much you want, which will just give you a nice little staggered look. And then from here, we can then add some rotation to it. So I'm gonna hit R, and I'm gonna keyframe the rotation, move forward a little bit, and let's just spread it this way. And I think this is a pretty good flourish, maybe a little bit less, something like that looks pretty good. And then, as you can see, it just makes it a little bit tilted. And the easiest way to counter this is to create a null. So I'm just gonna right click and create a null object, and then I'm gonna link this one to the null. And then if I hit R on the rotation, I'm gonna go back to the keyframe where they aren't tilted, keyframe that rotation, and then I just wanna go the opposite direction, so it's -11, so just go +11 to straighten that up, and then we get a perfect counter animation here, and it slides just a little bit. You can fix that if you want to. I don't think it looks bad necessarily, especially because I had the cards moving out to the side as well. So with a little bit of position animation, no one's gonna notice, but we are just gonna add a little bit of easing to this. And I'm just gonna use flow again, this time sexy speed for some nice, well, sexy speed. So playing that back, we now have a little bit of just a slight fan out and a position in. And it's really that simple. That's what goes into this card animation. Now, if you wanna take this to a little bit of a different direction, I suppose, you can turn this into a 3D card. I use that as well for one of them. It's just a nice little flare trick that you can do, but essentially what I'm gonna do is, in this instance, I'm just gonna delete everything but our main comp here, and just remove all of these keyframes. I just wanna make sure this is centered up in the middle of our composition. We turn it 3D, and then I'm gonna duplicate this. I'm just gonna open 2 view mode, and then I'm just gonna drag one of these behind a little bit. And I don't want it to be too big of a gap between them, because that will determine how thick the card is. So maybe just something pretty close to where we have it. Maybe something like that would be pretty good. And then I'm gonna create a solid. And the good thing is we know exactly the size that this needs to be. So you can even go into your card and just copy the card background and paste it in there. And then we just want to make sure that is centered up right in the middle, turn that into 3D as well, and then we just need to extrude it a little bit. And for that, we're going to change it to Cinema 4D or Advanced 3D, which will just give us that extrusion option. So now I've just changed it over to Cinema 4D Renderer. I'm going to open up the geometry options, and I'm just going to extrude this a little bit. So just extrude it until we meet. The good thing is we can open up the position of all of these, and we know that this is 12 pixels moved away, so we know that our extrusion has to be 12 as well. So let's just search for that and make sure that is right on the money. And we can move this card in the front over just a little bit so that we can actually see it. So maybe just move that to -1, and we can look at it from the back as well, and just make sure that maybe we put this at 13, just so we can see the card as well. Then we can go back into just one view mode, will be plenty fine. Now we can create a null, just a regular null object, and take all of these, and we're just gonna link them to the null, which we'll of course wanna turn into 3D as well. So I'm just gonna parent it right to that null. And just like that, we now have a 3D card. You can see we just have a nice little flip, and you can change the color of this as well. So in the card background or our extrusion, we'll just change that to be the same color as our border, so we get a nice seamless card. And that's it. And you just control it with the null, which makes it super easy to animate, and you get a perfect little card that flips. And that's it for the card animation. I made this title card a while ago for the video I did about backgrounds, and I got a lot of comments about how I did the gradient text, and it's a lot simpler than you might think. The first step is to create some text, and this part might be actually the hardest part of it, and we just want to pick something like gradient, and we'll just change the color to something we can actually see, and then we're just gonna center this up and pick a nice font. I think I used the Bradley DJR font, if I remember correctly, for it. At least this is a cool looking font, so we can definitely work with this. From there, you want to add whatever animations you want to it. Keep it simple, keep it clean. You don't need to go super crazy, but obviously you can if you want to. In our instance, let's just add a typewriter effect. Surely that'll work just fine. And hit U and just speed this up a little bit, maybe add a little bit of sexy speed to it. And now we just have a nice little typing animation. Super simple, doesn't have to be much more advanced than that. And once that is over, we can start making the gradient. And that is simply by creating a solid, and we're just gonna name this gradient. And then we are gonna add a fractal noise to this. You can also create your own gradient using shape layers and blurring them out and all that sort of stuff if you want more control over it. This is just a little bit faster. And essentially what you want to do here is create your little blobs. So you want to decrease the complexity a good bit, set it to something like 1, increase the size a good bit. Again, this depends on the look you're kind of going for your gradient, but I want it to be pretty big and blotchy. And you can play around with the settings here. You might want to add a little bit of a Softbox blur to smooth it out, set the iterations to 6, blur it out just a little bit, you know, get some nice smooth gradients from black to white, which is what is going to control our look. Essentially, scale this up a little bit more, maybe add something like a levels, and then you can control the contrast a little bit, decide where certain colors are going to bleed and all that stuff. And then what controls the gradient itself is the colorama effect, which uses the black and white values that we just played around with and assigns a color to them. You can pick whatever colors you want. This one is not particularly beautiful. They have some pretty nice presets like this one, for example, but we are just gonna start with a ramp gray, should work perfectly fine. And then I'm just gonna add a little bit of color to this, maybe a purplish color here. Boom. Maybe move that over because it's a pretty dark color, and maybe a yellowish, orangish color here, closer to the beginning. Just so a nice little smooth gradient here. And again, you can play around with the levels and the Softbox blur and all the settings here just to create a really smooth gradient, essentially. Boom. And then all we want to do is add a little bit of movement to this, which we are going to do in the evolution options. You can just alt-click the evolution, and then you can add an expression like time times 100, and that'll then just move the blotches around a little bit. And then all you got to do is, if you don't have a background like we have right now, you can just enable the track map thing, or you can go in and just pick whip it to the gradient, and that's it. There you have your text. And you can play around with the colors and all that good stuff. So it's super easy to customize, and you don't have to animate it yourself. So it's really super easy to work with. You can add a little bit of the sauce. So let's say we add a background here. We'll just make it a darkish background. Should work fine. Move that to the bottom, and I'm just gonna hit Command Y and create a grain. I'm gonna add the add grain effect, and I'm just gonna change it to final output, change the size to 1.3, the same with the softness, and the preset, I'm gonna do like a Codec Vision 800T, and then in the animation, or in the application, sorry, I'm gonna set it to film, and then I'm gonna add a tint to make it black and white, and then I'm just gonna pre-comp this and move all attributes into the new composition and just name this grain pre. And then one thing I forgot that is super important is in the solid itself, you can hit Shift Command Y to bring up the solid settings. You wanna make sure that the color of the background is 80, 80, 80, which is 50% gray, so that whenever we set this to overlay, you don't get any of that in there. So you just get the grain itself, and you can play around with the settings, but you can see it just gives it that little bit more character in there and the colors themselves. So it just adds just a little bit of spice to it. That is it for the gradient animation. You can do this with shapes, pretty much anything you want, you can do this. Just overlay it. This third animation is super fun if you want to add a little bit of depth to your scenes, which is sometimes what can take an animation from being pretty plain and simple, like this brain animation that I have right here. I just found it online, and you just want to make it look a little bit nicer. And that's where the grid room comes into play. But before I get into how you create the grid room itself, I want to talk a little bit about today's video sponsor, Artlist, and how I use it to make all my animations way sicker, and videos too. Now, I use Artlist for pretty much everything that I create, and I think that speaks volumes to how good this service is. They are an all-in-one platform with pretty much everything you need, from templates to music, sound effects, even footage like this brain that I've got right here on my screen. And now they even have an AI voiceover feature, so So if you need some narration for your project, you've got that available at your fingertips. Super easy to use and all made from real human voices, which by the way are exclusive to Artlist, so you won't be able to find them anywhere else. Anyways, that's just to say that they've got pretty much everything you need in one place, so you don't have to worry about multiple subscriptions for all your needs. Now let me show you how I actually get the most out of Artlist. It all starts on the website. Staying organized is a superpower. I love using the artboard feature to keep track of beautiful soundtracks that I come across whenever I look for new music, or even some of my favorite sound effects for certain types of things. By the way, if you are interested, I will have my collections linked below if you're looking for some sexy sound effects. Sometimes I end up picking a sound that doesn't fit exactly, but the good thing is I can always go back and use the find similar feature to find a sound effect that is close but just fits my project a little bit better. Back into DaVinci, layers on layers on layers, whooshes, clicks, atmosphere, musical loop, done. Using Artlist makes my life easier, and if you're interested in making your life easier as well, you can head to the link in the description where you can sign up for the annual subscription and get 2 months for free. I highly recommend it, and if you are in need of some sexy sound effects, they are linked in the description, at least the ones I use the most. But with that being said, let's cut back into creating this grid room. It's actually a lot easier than you might think. We're gonna hit Command Y to create a solid, and I'm just gonna name this grid 1, and let's change the color to, it doesn't really matter because we will change that later, but let's just set it to a white for now, and we're gonna add the grid effect, which is built in to After Effects. Super nice. So now we get this transparent grid. I'm just gonna disable transparency for a second so we can see what we're actually doing. And I'm gonna change the size from to a width slider because I know I want this to just be squares. You can set it to be whatever you want. Width slider or width and height slider is by far the easiest. The corner point is miserable to work with. I wouldn't use that at all. Then I'm gonna decrease the border to something like 3 just to make it a little bit more dainty. Maybe decrease the size of this just a little bit, like that. That looks pretty good to me. Now we're gonna position this in 3D space. I'm gonna enable 3D and I'm just gonna keep this in classic 3D. We don't need anything fancier than that. And I'm gonna hit P and I'm just gonna move this back into 3D space. Now you can move this pretty far back. Just want to make sure that everything is covered. So this will be like in your room. You can scale this down too if you need to. From there, it's pretty simple. I'm going to duplicate this and I'm going to move this anchor point to either right, left, top, or bottom. We're going to do all 4. It doesn't matter which way you do it in. I'm going to use Motion Tools, which is a free plugin to use just to move the anchor point. Otherwise, you can hit Y and move your anchor point, and you just want to make sure snapping is enabled, and you can just move it and it'll snap in position. But alas, Motion Tools is faster. So I've moved it to the right. I'm just gonna hit R on this one, and then we're just gonna move the rotation. We're gonna position this at minus 90 degrees so we get a nice room. You can also add a camera, which is gonna make it your life a little bit easier because you can actually see what it's gonna look like in the end a lot easier. So let's add a camera. Now you wanna be pretty deliberate in how wide your camera is. 20 millimeters is gonna give you a lot more fake depth. It's going to give you a little bit of that nice distortion that you might see. So anything below 20 millimeters is going to work pretty well for this. You can go in at a longer focal length, like 50, 80, something like that, but you might just need to extend it or increase the size of your grid itself. So let's just do 15 because it's going to be nice and crazy. You can see how far that kind of extends compared to if I had, let's change this to a 50 mil. You can see how different that looks. So let's just stick with the 15 millimeter for now, and we're gonna duplicate the back one again, and then this time move the anchor point over to the left hand side, and we're just gonna rotate the Y rotation 90 degrees this time. And again, we're gonna duplicate the first one, move the anchor point to the bottom, rotate it around the X rotation, and again, we're just gonna put this at 90 degrees to get that nice floor. And then we're gonna duplicate the main one again and move the anchor point to the top, and then rotate this, and this time we'll do minus 90, and then now we have our room. You can see we are missing a little bit in terms of the perspective, but we can move the camera in a little bit. So if I hit P, we can just move the position of the camera in until the top and bottom are covered. Otherwise, you can just change the size of the solid as well. That'll work just fine. It's not perfectly connected in the corners, which you can go in and adjust the size and sliders and position of everything, but most of the time you're not really gonna notice it because what we're gonna do is create a background now, and let's just set this to a slight off-white color, or a light gray, I guess you can call it, and just put that in the back, just so it's very, very faint, our little background. Just adds some depth. You can also go ahead and put your footage or text in 3D space as well, just to add to that depth and maybe layer multiple items, but it's not necessary because we already get that depth just from it being right there. And you can animate the position of the camera, which will look better if you also put the footage or text in 3D space, because then everything moves accordingly. Otherwise, you can just go and link everything to nulls. But in this instance, just to make it a little bit easier, let's put this in 3D space and let's hit P to bring up the position and just move this back so it actually fits in there. Let's say right here, and let's play with the position. We can just keyframe it right there, move forward a little bit and just zoom in like that. And then we can just add some simple easing to this. Again, we'll just do a sexy speed here, and playing that back, we now just get a nice little zoom animation. Boom, and you can see the room moves with it. It just looks good. That's pretty much it for creating a grid room. Nice way of creating some depth in your scenes and keeping them from being flat and stagnant. If you've seen any Dodford video, you've probably seen the beautiful and super sexy CRT TV, old retro TV scene that he uses a bunch. It's a great way of just spicing up some footage, especially if you have some older looking footage. It creates a nice atmosphere. There's a couple of different ways you can go about this. We today are just going to be covering probably the easiest way and the way you're going to fake it in After Effects. Otherwise, there's two other ways that you can really go about it, but we're not going to be covering how to actually do that today. But before I show you the differences, we need some footage to work with. Now, if you have something that is older, like actual vintage footage, it's obviously going to work better because it already has that texture in there. Otherwise, there is a few ways that we can fake that look. In my instance, I'm just going to use a screen grab of myself because why not? You know, there's nothing wrong with looking at this beautiful face. And there's a couple of different ways you can do this. Now, if you have Motion Array, which, you know, affiliate link in the description if you're interested, they have a couple of different looks that you can work with that makes this process a lot simpler. I'm just going to create an adjustment layer and then I'm going to add, you can do something like the D-Res one, which is super sick, very, very stylized. Pick something like the horizontal glitch lines, which just gives you that nice look. You can play around with the opacity of it and strength, or something like the scan lines that they have as well, which is again just an easy way of creating this. Maybe set it to moderate, just gives you that nice little scan line look. You can also go ahead and create it yourself with a fairly simple effect stack. We're going to start by adding a mosaic, and essentially our goal here is just to make it look worse quality than what it is. I'm going to increase this to something like 500 by 500 for now, and we can always play around with the size of this, but we just want to make it look a little bit softer, just because that is typically the style that you'd go for. Then we're going to add a Venetian blinds, which is going to be what controls our lines. We're just going to set that to 90 degrees so that we get that nice scan line look. And we can change the width of this. We're going to go pretty small, but not too small. I'd say something like 8 looks pretty good. And you can always play around with the transition completion for the width between it. Next is a limit true color, and this is just to play around with the color a little bit. Typically older footage might look a little bit different, maybe a little bit more overexposed, maybe a little bit more contrasty, maybe even a little bit warmer, but you just want to play around with it until you get a look that you think kind of works. You can play around with the highlights and the shadows to get something that you want. I just like having it in there just for that extra bit of stylization. And then we want to add a fast box blur and just set that something to like 1 or something like that, just so it's not completely black in between. You can see if we remove this, it's just very harsh, but this just gives it that softness of the scan lines. And you can play around with this. You can even set it something like 0.5, just very, very subtle. And then we're going to add an unsharp mask just to give it that little bit of crispness back. And you can play around with the look of this, set it up however much you want. I think the default settings look pretty good. But that is essentially how you would fake the CRT kind of grungier look, and you can just use this effect stack and apply it to anything that you want and it'll get this look. So pretty simple, pretty quick, and it'll definitely do the job, especially once we add everything else to it. But now let's say this is our footage, then we'll go ahead and pre-compose this, and we'll just name this TV footage pre, and then we can go back into our project folder, and we just want to make sure that, let's say this is in assets and TV footage is in pre, because it is a pre-comp. Now I've created this little scene here in Bing AI image generator, whatever, and it's pretty big, which is good. I've just used a Photoshop upscale to scale this up. But the main thing here is it has a super nice scene to it. It has a nice little TV, and it's gonna work perfectly for what we're trying to create here. I'm just gonna scale this down a little bit to fit on the sides and set the tone a little bit better. And then we can double click this, and I'm just gonna zoom in here, and I just wanna mask out the screen here. So I'm just gonna go in and roughly create a mask here. So that looks pretty good. And I am just gonna go back into the composition here. Boom. So now we've got the TV cutout, and I'm just gonna duplicate this, and then I'm gonna name this TV cutout, and I'm gonna name this TV rest. And I'm just gonna sandwich our footage in between. And then I'm gonna hit M on the back, and I'm just gonna invert this. Let's take this TV footage, and we're just gonna scale this down so it actually fits in the TV itself. And then we can use that as a track matte so we get the actual size of it. And we can, to the TV footage itself, we can add a optics compensation, which will just let us get that bulge. So I'm just gonna increase the size of that a good bit. And you can see we just get that bulge kind of look, which is perfect. Just increase that a little bit more so that everything is nice and decent. Re-enable the cutout, and then change the blending mode. You can play around with this, and the reason we want to do this is just to get a little bit of that reflection that we get on the TV itself. So something like that might be pretty good. And from there, we can just create a null. So I'm just going to right click and create a new null object. And I want to make sure that this null object is in the middle of my face, or the middle of the TV, I should say. So I'm just going to move that to be right there, just so that whenever we move this, that is our focal point. Then we can take all of these and let's just link them to the null, and then that's pretty much it. So keyframe the position there and the scale as well, and then go back and increase that. There we have a nice little TV animation. You can reverse this whichever way you want, but this is a super simple way of adding just a little bit of that TV look to it. So that's how we would essentially fake it in After Effects. You can add a little bit of grain to this as well. We can just use the one we used previously. You can just copy this one, paste that in there just for a little bit of more grain. You can add an adjustment layer to this as well. So if I hit Shift Command Y, and let's just add a levels effect, and then just increase the highlights a little bit like that, and then hit T to bring up the opacity, and then we can alt click it, and then we can add an expression. We can do a posterized time just to slow it down a little bit, maybe 6, and then we can do a wiggle 50 by 50. That'll just give us a little bit of flicker, make it look a little bit more vintagey. Just all adds to the feel of this. Now the benefit of doing it this way is that you can create a scene around it. The two other ways, it might be a little bit more difficult depending on your situation. The other way to do it is in Blender, where you can create your own scene. It'll be a little bit more 3D looking, but you'll still need to do the footage treatment. However, you will get a nicer reflection on it as well, especially if you know how to use materials. The last way, the most complicated, but in my opinion probably also the sexiest one, is to actually use an old CRT TV and display the footage on there. Now you'll have a harder time with the set design. This is just probably the easiest way, and you can add a little bit of stylization to make it look really good like we just have right here. Now we are going to end this tutorial on a fun note, and that is an expression that is super fun to use and can help you create some pretty cool looking animations, and that is the look at me expression. Now I'm not going to pretend to know the in-depth workings of the expressions because I'm not that smart, but I do know how to use them. If you are interested in learning more about them, I would recommend clicking the link in the description where you can read about the expression itself, but I'm just going to show you how you can use it to create some fun stuff. Now we're going to start with a subject, and for this case I'm just going to use a circle, and I'm just going to set the color to white, and it's just going to be a nice little circle here in the middle, and the color didn't change. That's great. Boom. And we're just going to put that in the middle, and then we are going to create a bunch of other little shapes. In this case, let's whip out the polygon tool. Let's just draw out a polygon here, and then we are just going to set it to, let's do a 4-point polygon, and actually let's just change it to a star. Let's look a little bit cooler, and let's change the inner radius of it to be a little bit more pointy, and I think that looks pretty good. You can set the rotation to 0 just so it's perfectly aligned, you know, but change it, make it look however you want, play around with the roundness, and then we can just take this, let's change the label color to something so we can differentiate it. And I'm just going to duplicate this a whole bunch of times, and we're just going to put this wherever we want. You could create something like a path where this follows along, where let's say our character, aka our circle, is the star, and all these other points are just little jealous people that are spying on our success. This should be plenty of copies, and I'm going to use my After Effects cheat sheet, which I have in Notion. I have a bunch of different expressions. I'm going to copy this expression, and I am going to just pick one of them. I'm going to hit R, and we're going to add this to the rotation. So I'm going to alt click the rotation, and I'm going to paste that in. And then at the very bottom, where it says look at 2D, where it says sum layer, I'm just going to delete that, and I'm going to use the pick whip and select my shape layer, and that is it. You can see this rotated to face the circle, which is the whole point of the expression. So now we can just right click the expression, copy expression only, and select all our others and paste, and boom. Just like that, everyone is looking at our circle. And now if we move it, everything moves along with it to always focus on that. And that just makes it a lot easier if you have a big array of objects that you all want to focus on the same object. Like let's say this was a cursor. The crazy thing about this too is you can move this around and it'll move around with it. So you can have this spin around and always face that center object as well. Even if you hide the object, it'll still work. So you can have this as a focal point and then just have this rotate around it and always be pointed at this. So it just leaves a lot of room to create some really interesting animations using an expression to make your life a lot easier so you don't have to animate the rotation yourself. But that pretty much sums up today's video. Just a few different animations, techniques that you can use to spice up your work. We can always use spice in our life. Let's not be silly. But I just want to say thank you for following along. Thank you to Artlist for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out. Link in the description. Sound effects I use also in the description. Project file for this project also in the description. So a plethora of goodies available to you. And outside of that, I just want to say thank you. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, I suppose. And I'll see you again in the next video. Peace out.